It was one of those nights when the cold seeps into your bones and silence covers everything like a heavy blanket. The wind whistled outside, and I remember sitting near the fireplace, sipping tea and feeling grateful for the warmth around me. My house wasn't just bricks and wood, it was the story of my life. Every corner held a memory, every wall had heard laughter and tears alike. The old photo frames on the shelf, the marks on the kitchen counter from years of cooking, even the squeaky stair that I never got around to fixing, everything was a part of who I was. That night I went to bed thinking about how blessed I was to have this home, this comfort and this peace. But life, as I learned that night, doesn't always give warnings before it takes everything away. It started with the faintest smell of smoke. At first, I thought it was just the fireplace, maybe a bit of wood burning unevenly, but within seconds I heard a crackling sound that didn't belong. When I opened my bedroom door, a wave of thick, suffocating smoke rushed in. My heart froze. For a moment I stood there, unable to move, hoping it was a dream. But then I saw the orange glow crawling up the walls of the hallway, growing fast, alive, and hungry. Panic took over. I grabbed the nearest blanket, covered my mouth, and tried to make my way to the front door. But the heat was unbearable, flames licked at the furniture, the curtains were already gone, and I could hear the wood cracking under the pressure of the fire. The sound was terrifying, a mix of destruction and despair. I remember shouting for help, my voice barely cutting through the roaring flames. The neighbors must have seen the smoke, because soon I heard someone yelling outside. I stumbled out the door, coughing, barely able to see through my tears and the haze. The cold air hit my face, and for a brief moment I felt alive, grateful to have escaped. But then I turned around and saw it, my home, my everything, burning. The flames danced through the windows, lighting up the night sky like a cruel celebration. The fire moved fast, devouring everything it touched, and all I could do was watch. I wanted to rush back in, to save something, anything. A photo album, a keepsake, a memory, but the firefighters held me back. "It's too dangerous," they said. I knew they were right, but it didn't make it any easier. Standing there on the street, barefoot and trembling, I felt smaller than I ever had in my life. Neighbors gathered around, offering blankets and words of comfort, but their voices felt distant, muffled by the sound of cracking wood and collapsing walls. Each crash made my heart sink deeper. Every minute that passed, I saw another piece of my past turn to ash: the couch where my husband and I used to sit together, the kitchen where I baked my son's favorite cake on his birthdays, the bedroom that once smelled of lavender and peace. Everything I had built, everything I had loved, was being erased in front of my eyes. The fire trucks came, sirens wailing, lights flashing red and blue against the smoke. The firefighters worked hard, spraying water into the heart of the blaze, but I knew it was too late. The house was gone long before the fire stopped burning. I stood there, wrapped in a borrowed coat, watching the water turn to steam as it hit the glowing embers. The smell of smoke clung to my hair, my clothes, even my skin. It wasn't just the house that burned, it was a lifetime of memory. When the last flame finally died out, there was nothing left but a blackened skeleton of what once was my home. The roof had collapsed, the walls were scorched, and everything inside was unrecognizable. I took a few hesitant steps forward, the ground still warm beneath my feet. I could barely breathe, not just because of the smoke, but because of the emptiness inside me. It was as if someone had reached into my chest and taken everything that mattered. I tried to be strong, to remind myself that at least I was alive, but in that moment, survival didn't feel like enough. The firefighters came over to speak with me, their faces kind but tired. One of them said softly, "Ma'am, you're lucky to be alive." I nodded, but the word lucky felt hollow. Lucky people don't lose their homes overnight. Lucky people don't stand in the cold watching decades of love and effort turn to dust. I knew they meant well, so I just whispered, "Thank you," and turned away. The night was quiet again, except for the faint hiss of smoke rising from the ruins. The stars above looked cold and distant, and I remember thinking how unfair it was that the world kept shining while mine had just gone dark. When everyone started leaving, I found myself alone. The neighbors went back inside, The firefighters packed their equipment, and I was left standing there, staring at the charred remains of what used to be my home. The loneliness hit me harder than the loss itself. Where would I go now? I had no clothes, no bed, no photographs, nothing. The only thing I had was the small bag I had managed to grab while escaping, the bag that held my phone, a wallet, and a few papers. Everything else, everything that once defined my life, was gone. In that silent moment, the cold began to bite through the thin blanket someone had draped over my shoulders. I shivered, not just from the weather, but from the realization that I had nowhere to turn. The people who had stood by me minutes ago had returned to their warm homes, and I had none left. My mind was a blur, but one thought kept coming back to me: my son, my only child. The boy I had raised with love and sacrifice, the one for whom I had worked countless hours, the one I thought would always be there for me. Maybe this was the time to lean on him, to ask for help. I pulled out my phone and stared at his name on the screen. My hands were shaking not just from the cold, but from hesitation. It's hard, sometimes, for a parent to admit they need their child. You spend your whole life being the protector, the provider, the one who fixes everything, and suddenly, when the roles reverse, it feels unnatural, almost wrong, but I had no choice. With tears in my eyes, I pressed the call button. The phone rang a few times before I heard his voice, familiar, warm, but distant. I tried to stay calm, but as soon as I spoke, my voice cracked. "Son," I said softly, "the house, it's gone. Everything's gone." There was silence on the other end, and for a moment I thought the call had dropped. Then he spoke, "I'll come get you." That one sentence was enough to bring a small spark of hope back into my chest. For the first time that night, I felt like maybe I wasn't completely lost. I waited on the side of the road, watching the smoke drift into the sky, clutching my small bag close. My body was trembling, but my heart whispered comfort. My son was coming. In that darkness, I believed that love would carry me home again. I didn't know then that the road ahead would hold more heartbreak than I could ever imagine. For that brief, fragile moment, all I felt was relief that I wasn't alone anymore. When I called my son that night, my heart was pounding as if it wanted to burst out of my chest. My fingers trembled as I pressed his name on the phone screen, and for a few seconds I just stared at it, afraid to hear his voice, afraid of what he might say. But I had no one else to turn to. I had spent my life being strong, solving problems, and holding things together, but now I felt like a lost child, cold, broken, and desperate for comfort. When he finally answered, the sound of his voice brought a strange mix of relief and sorrow. I tried to speak, but the words stuck in my throat. "Son," I managed to say, my voice shaking, "the house, it's gone. Everything's gone." There was a pause, longer than I expected, and in that silence I felt the weight of everything pressing down on me. When he finally said, "I'll come get you," I almost cried out of gratitude. That single sentence was like a rope thrown to someone drowning. I stood by the roadside, the night cold and still around me. The air was thick with smoke, and the faint orange glow from the dying embers of my house flickered behind me. I pulled the blanket tighter around my shoulders, trying to keep out the chill. Cars passed now and then, their headlights brushing against me before disappearing down the road. Every time I saw a pair of lights approaching, I hoped it was him. My mind was spinning, replaying memories from years ago, his first day at school, the time he cried when he scraped his knee, how he used to run into my arms after coming home. Those were the moments I held onto to keep myself from falling apart. I told myself that no matter how hard things had been, no matter how distant he'd grown after marriage, love would always bring him back to me. When his car finally appeared in the distance, headlights cutting through the fog, I felt my chest tighten with emotion. As he pulled over, I could see his face illuminated by the dashboard light. He looked tired, maybe even worried, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw the little boy he used to be. I hurried toward him, clutching my small bag, and before I could say anything, he opened the door. I whispered, "Thank you for coming," my voice barely audible over the hum of the engine. He nodded slightly, but didn't say much. I could feel his unease, though I tried to convince myself that he was just shocked. As I settled into the car, I looked around at the clean interior, the faint scent of air freshener, and a child's toy lying on the seat beside me. It reminded me of the times when he was the one sitting in the back seat, clutching his toys, talking non-stop about his day. I smiled through my tears, thinking of those years when everything revolved around him, his happiness, his comfort, his dreams. I remembered working extra shifts just to buy him his first bicycle, staying up late, helping with school projects, and standing in the rain outside his school, waiting for him to finish. Every sacrifice I had made seemed worth it at the time because it was all for him. The car ride was quiet, too quiet. I wanted to talk, to ask about his family, to tell him how much it meant that he came for me, but something in his expression kept me silent. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his eyes fixed on the road. There was no anger in him, just a kind of distance, like he was driving a stranger instead of his mother. I told myself that maybe he was just in shock. After all, finding out that your childhood home had burned down couldn't be easy. But deep down there was a faint ache, a whisper of fear that something between us had changed, something I couldn't quite name. As we drove through the sleeping town, I looked out the window and watched the streetlights pass one by one. Every light reminded me of home, of the warmth I once had, of how many nights I'd waited for him to come home late from work, just so I could ask if he'd eaten. It's strange how a mother's love never stops worrying, even when her child becomes an adult. I wanted to tell him that he didn't need to worry about me, that I would get back on my feet somehow, but the words wouldn't come. I was exhausted, physically, emotionally, spiritually. The silence between us grew heavier with each passing minute, and I could feel the distance stretching wider. I caught my reflection in the car window, my face pale and streaked with soot, my hair was messy, my eyes swollen from crying. I looked like a stranger to myself. I thought of how, when he was young, he used to tell me that I was the strongest person he knew. "You can do anything, Mom," he'd say, with pure faith in his voice. I used to smile and believe him, but now, sitting there in his car, broken and dependent, I didn't feel strong anymore. I felt like a shadow of the woman I used to be, a woman who once had a purpose, who once had a home. We reached his neighborhood after what felt like hours. The houses there were tall and modern, with neatly trimmed lawns and warm lights glowing through the windows. Everything looked peaceful, untouched by tragedy. I watched as families sat together inside, laughing, eating dinner, living their ordinary lives. For a moment I wondered if they knew how lucky they were. My son parked the car in front of his house and turned off the engine. He still didn't say much. I could tell he was struggling to find the right words. Maybe he didn't know what to say to someone who'd lost everything. As we sat there in silence, I tried to fill the emptiness with hope. I told myself that this was the beginning of something new, that I would stay with him for a while, help around the house, be close to my grandson, and maybe in time, find peace again. I thought of the warmth of family dinners, of helping his wife with the chores, of telling bedtime stories to the little one. The thought brought a small smile to my face. Love, I believed, would heal everything. After all, I had given him everything I could when he was growing up. Surely now, he would want to give me comfort in return. I turned to look at him, wanting to thank him again, but he was already stepping out of the car. He didn't notice the tears forming in my eyes. I took a deep breath and followed him, my feet aching from the cold ground. As we walked up the driveway, I felt a strange mixture of gratitude and uncertainty. The house looked warm and inviting, but there was a small, almost invisible tension in the air that made me uneasy. Still, I pushed that feeling aside. I reminded myself that family is built on love, and love always finds a way to make space, even when life gets complicated. As he opened the front door and gestured for me to come in, I felt a flicker of hope again. I told myself that this was my chance to start over, that my son's home could become my home now, even if just for a while. I didn't know then that the days ahead would test that hope, that the love I had always believed in so deeply would soon be overshadowed by silence, hesitation, and quiet rejection. But that night, as I stepped into his house, I carry with me only one thought: the belief that no matter what happens, a mother's love and a son's heart would always find their way back to each other. When his car finally stopped in front of his house, I took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm of emotions inside me. My heart was filled with relief, gratitude, and a small flicker of fear I couldn't quite explain. I looked at my son, my only child, sitting beside me, and felt a wave of memories crashing through my mind. It seemed like only yesterday that I was the one driving him home from school, his tiny voice filling the car as he told me about his day. Now, decades later, I was sitting quietly in his car, waiting for him to speak, waiting for reassurance that I still had a place in his world. But instead of the warmth I hoped for, there was a silence so heavy it pressed against my chest. He looked at me with eyes that seemed distant, almost nervous, as if he wasn't sure what to do with me now that I was here. When he finally spoke, his words were soft but sharp enough to pierce through the fragile hope I carried with me. "Mom, you can stay with us for a few days," he said, his eyes avoiding mine. "Just a few days." Those 3 words echoed in my mind like a quiet thunder. I forced a smile, pretending not to notice how temporary it sounded. Maybe he meant it out of concern, I told myself. Maybe he didn't want me to feel like a burden. Or perhaps he thought I'd find something else soon. But deep down, something inside me cracked. After all that had happened, after losing my home, my memories, and my sense of belonging, I needed more than a few days. I needed to feel safe again, to feel wanted. As he drove into the driveway, I looked at his house, a beautiful modern home with warm lights spilling from the windows. It looked perfect, peaceful, everything I had hoped for him to have in life. I had spent years praying that he would have comfort and stability, and seeing it now should have made me happy. And in a way, it did. But there was also a quiet ache in my heart, because while this house looked like a home, I wasn't sure if it would ever feel like one for me. He helped me with my small bag, and as I followed him up the steps, my mind kept replaying his words. A few days, maybe he didn't mean it literally. Maybe he just needed time to adjust to having me there. I decided to believe that because believing anything else would have hurt too much. I tried to push away the doubt that was growing inside me. After all, he had come for me. He had opened his door. That had to mean something. When we stepped inside, the first thing I noticed was the quiet order of everything. The polished floor, the neat furniture, the scent of candles mixed with a faint trace of dinner. His wife appeared from the kitchen, her smile polite but distant, the kind people wear when they're trying to be kind but don't quite know how. "Oh, you're here," she said softly. "I'm so sorry about the house." I nodded and murmured a thank you, trying to ignore the uneasy tone beneath her words. Her eyes flicked briefly toward my smoky clothes, my tired face, and then away again. I understood. I was bringing chaos into her well-arranged world. She showed me to the guest room. It was clean and neatly made, but there was a coldness to it, a kind of emptiness that told me it wasn't used often. The bed was soft, the lamp glowed warmly, yet the air felt unfamiliar, like I was a visitor in a place where I didn't quite belong. Still, I told myself to be grateful. I sat on the edge of the bed, running my hand across the blanket, and tried to imagine that this could be home for a little while. I could help them, I thought. I could cook, clean, watch my grandson when they were busy. I could still be useful. I could still be part of their lives. The next morning, I woke early, as I always had. Old habits don't die easily. I went to the kitchen, hoping to make breakfast before they woke up, to do something that showed I appreciated being there. But as I stood by the stove, I heard whispers from the hallway, his wife's voice, soft but clear enough to catch. "She's up already? I thought we agreed she'd rest." My son murmured something in response, but I couldn't make out the word. There was a tone in his voice, though, gentle, uneasy, the kind people use when they're trying to keep peace between two sides. I quietly returned to the guest room, my appetite gone. Throughout the day, I tried to stay out of the way. I played with my grandson, who at first seemed shy around me. He was a sweet child, full of energy and laughter, but I could sense he wasn't used to having me around. I tried to teach him a simple game I used to play with his father, but before long, his mother called him away for lunch. It stung more than I wanted to admit. I told myself not to take it personally, but a mother's heart feels every small distance, every quiet rejection. When my son returned from work that evening, I waited for him in the living room. I wanted to talk, to tell him how grateful I was, how proud I felt seeing the life he had built. But when he walked in, he looked tired, distracted. He smiled briefly and said, "Mom, you should get some rest. We'll talk tomorrow." He didn't mean to hurt me. I knew that. But love isn't always about intention. Sometimes it's about attention, and I could feel mine slipping away. As the days passed, the unease in the house grew heavier. I could feel the tension in the small pauses between conversations, the quick glances exchanged when they thought I wasn't looking. His wife began to talk less to me, and my son seemed torn between guilt and obligation. I started to wonder if I had made a mistake by coming. Maybe I should have gone somewhere else, anywhere else. But where does a person go when the only home they had has turned to ashes, and the people they love most seem to wish they hadn't come? At night I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of everything. The silence of the house felt different from the silence of my old home. There, it had been peaceful. Here, it was cold, heavy, filled with things left unsaid. I could hear muffled voices sometimes. My son and his wife talking softly in their room. I couldn't make out the words, but I didn't need to. My heart already knew. Still, I didn't let myself cry. I had cried enough when the fire took my home. I refused to let loneliness take what was left of my strength. Instead, I prayed quietly, asking for understanding, for patience, for love that didn't feel like pity. I told myself that family sometimes just needs time, that once the shock of everything faded, things would get better. But deep down, I was beginning to realize that time doesn't always fix what distance has already broken. I looked at my son differently now, not with anger, but with a kind of aching acceptance. He was no longer the boy who needed me. He was a man who had his own world, his own priorities, and perhaps no space left for mine. Still, he was my son, and even as I felt the walls around me grow colder, I couldn't stop loving him. I couldn't stop hoping that one day he'd look at me not as a guest, but as his mother again. When I first moved into my son's house, I tried to tell myself that everything would eventually feel normal, that time would soften the strangeness between us. I kept reminding myself that this was temporary, that all I needed was to find my footing again. But as the days passed, the invisible line separating me from the rest of the household grew clearer. My son's wife, though polite, seemed to carry a quiet discomfort in her every gesture. She never said anything unkind, but sometimes silence speaks louder than words. Her smiles were brief, practiced, and always ended before they reached her eyes. I could feel the stiffness in the air every time I entered a room, as though my presence slightly disrupted the rhythm of their home. I tried not to let it bother me. I told myself that maybe she just needed time to adjust to having me there. After all, I hadn't planned to burden them. I had lost my home overnight, my world reduced to ashes, and I simply needed a place to rest, to recover. But soon I began to notice small things. The way her tone changed when she spoke to me compared to how she spoke to my son or her child, the way she avoided sitting with me at meals, or how she always seemed to have something urgent to do whenever I tried to start a conversation. It was never overtly rude, just carefully distant. The guest room was clean, tidy, and comfortable enough, but it didn't feel like a home. I would wake up early every morning, long before anyone else, just to keep myself occupied. I'd make tea, tidy up the kitchen, and try to prepare breakfast, wanting to feel useful. But more often than not, my efforts were quietly dismissed. "Oh, you don't have to do that, Mom," my son would say when he came in, his voice polite but hesitant, as if afraid his wife might hear and disapprove. I would smile and sit down, pretending it didn't sting. But inside, I felt the slow, painful realization that I wasn't really part of their life. I was an extra piece they didn't quite know where to fit. During the day, I'd try to spend time with my grandson. He was a bright little boy, full of laughter and questions. For a while, being with him made me forget everything. I'd tell him stories, braid his hair, or teach him small things like how to fold paper boats. But even that comfort didn't last long. His mother would often interrupt, saying he had homework to do or screen time to limit. I understood, of course, she was just being a mother, but each time she took him away, I felt something inside me sink a little deeper. It wasn't just about the boy, it was about the quiet message that my presence wasn't needed, that I was slowly being pushed to the sidelines of a life I had once been the center of. In the evenings, I tried to make conversation with my son. I'd ask about his work, about how things were going, or about his health. He always answered politely, but our talks never went deep. He would nod, smile faintly, and then excuse himself to check emails or help his son with homework. I missed the days when we could talk for hours about everything, when he would tell me about his dreams, his worries, his plans. Now it felt like there was a wall between us, one that neither of us knew how to climb. At night, when the house was quiet, I would lie awake staring at the ceiling, thinking about my old home. The sounds of this house were different. The hum of an air conditioner, the muffled laughter from another room, the creak of footsteps that never stopped outside my door. It wasn't mine. I missed the comforting familiarity of my own space, the scent of my jasmine plants by the window, the sound of the old clock ticking in the hallway, the way sunlight used to pour into my kitchen each morning. Now I had nothing but this small room and my memories, which felt both comforting and cruel at the same time. I began to notice the smallest details. The way their laughter faded when I entered the living room, the quick exchange of glances between my son and his wife when I offered to cook dinner, the faint sighs when I lingered too long in the kitchen. They never said anything, but I could feel it. Their desire to have their routine back, their space, their quiet. I was the unspoken disruption in their comfortable life. The realization broke me slowly, quietly, without any single moment of confrontation. It wasn't hatred or anger I saw in their eyes. It was inconvenience, the kind of discomfort people feel when they're forced to adjust to something that doesn't quite fit. One afternoon, while I was folding laundry, I overheard them talking in the next room. I hadn't meant to listen, but their voices carried through the hallway. His wife was speaking softly, but her words still reached me. "I know she's your mother, but this isn't working. The house feels tense. We need our space." My heart clenched, and I froze, the fabric slipping from my hands. My son didn't respond right away, and for a moment I hoped he would defend me, reassure her, tell her that it was only temporary, but his silence said more than words ever could. When he finally spoke, his voice was tired. "I know, just give it some time." I quietly went back to folding the clothes, blinking back tears that refused to stay hidden. That evening, I pretended everything was fine. I smiled through dinner, complimented her cooking, and laughed at my grandson's jokes. But inside, something had shifted. I realized that no matter how much I tried to belong, I was an outsider in my own son's home. I began to withdraw little by little, staying mostly in my room, keeping out of the way. I stopped cooking, stopped offering help, stopped trying to start conversations. If they wanted space, I would give it to them. I told myself that love sometimes means stepping back, even when it hurts. Yet, despite everything, I couldn't stop loving them. Every time I saw my son walk through the door after work, I still felt that old familiar warmth. Every time my grandson smiled, it reminded me why I had fought so hard through life to see my family happy and safe. But love, I was learning, doesn't always guarantee closeness. Sometimes it just lingers quietly in the background, unseen but still alive. The hardest part wasn't their distance, it was realizing how easily I had become invisible in the very life I helped build. My son had his own world now, and I wasn't part of it. I was a guest, tolerated but not embraced, present but not included. I wanted to tell him that all I ever needed was not space or comfort, but love. The same love I had once poured into every meal, every bedtime story, every sacrifice. But the words never came. Mothers, I suppose, are used to swallowing their pain for the sake of their children. As I lay in bed that night, I closed my eyes and thought of my old house again. It was gone, reduced to ash, but in my mind it was still alive. The warmth, the laughter, the scent of home-cooked meals, the sound of my son's footsteps echoing down the hallway. That house had burned down, but the real loss wasn't the walls or the furniture. It was this, the slow fading of love, the quiet distance growing between me and the boy I had once held so close. In that quiet guest room, surrounded by silence that wasn't mine, I realized that sometimes the worst kind of loneliness isn't being alone, it's being forgotten in the very place you thought you belonged. It was a quiet morning, the kind where sunlight filters softly through the curtains and the world feels deceptively calm. I was sitting at the kitchen table with my cup of tea, thinking about how I might make myself a little more useful that day, maybe do the laundry or cook lunch before my son and his wife got home. I had been trying my best to stay out of the way while still showing my appreciation for their kindness. I knew they hadn't expected me to stay long, and I could sense their discomfort growing, but I kept hoping that, with time, things might feel natural again. I wanted to believe that love, even if strained, would find its way back into this house. But that morning, everything changed. My son came into the kitchen, his face calm but distant, like someone rehearsing a difficult conversation. I looked up and smiled at him, though my heart immediately sensed that something was wrong. He hesitated for a moment, standing by the counter, as if searching for the right words. Then, without looking directly at me, he said quietly, "Mom, maybe it's better if we find you a place of your own. There's a retirement community nearby." For a moment I couldn't process what I'd just heard. The spoon in my hand froze midair, the sound of it clinking softly against the cup felt louder than it should have. I stared at him, waiting for him to laugh or say he didn't mean it. But his face remained serious, almost apologetic. My heart tightened in my chest, and I felt an ache so deep it left me breathless. I wanted to ask him why so soon, why like this, but the words caught in my throat. He continued talking, explaining that it would be better for everyone, that I'd have more peace and company with people my age. Each word felt like a small knife, polite but sharp, cutting deeper with every sentence. I wanted to tell him that I didn't need company. I had my family. I wanted to remind him that I wasn't a stranger to this life, that I was the one who raised him, who built his world brick by brick with my own hands, who worked double shifts to pay for his schooling, who stayed up nights when he was sick, who spent years dreaming that he'd have everything I never did. I wanted to tell him that my only wish, after losing my home, was to be near the people I loved most. But as I looked at him, I saw something in his eyes, hesitation, guilt, maybe even fear, and I realized that saying anything would only make it harder for both of us. So I swallowed the pain and nodded slowly. Inside, though, my heart was shattering. I thought about the night of the fire, about how everything I owned had burned away in a few cruel minutes. I had told myself that it was only material things, that as long as I had my son, I still had something to hold on to. But now, sitting across from him in that kitchen, I understood that I had lost more than a home that night. I had lost my place in his life. I tried to speak, to say something that would ease the tension, but my voice came out shaky. "If that's what you think is best," I whispered, forcing a small smile. "Maybe you're right." I could feel my hands trembling, so I clasped them together to hide it. I didn't want him to see how much it hurt. A part of me still wanted to protect him from guilt, from regret, from the weight of what he was doing. Mothers don't stop caring, even when their hearts are breaking. He nodded, relieved that I hadn't argued. That relief was another wound. It told me that my leaving would make things easier for him, that my presence had become a burden he was finally ready to let go of. He started explaining the details, how the retirement community was nice, how they had activities and friendly people, how he'd help me get settled. His voice was calm, practical, almost businesslike, and I realized he was trying to make it sound like a kindness. But no matter how gently he said it, I heard the truth beneath his words. There was no space for me in his world anymore. I sat there listening, nodding quietly, but inside I was drowning. Every sentence reminded me of how time changes people, how distance doesn't always come from miles, but from hearts that drift apart slowly, unnoticed, until one day you wake up and realize you're no longer needed. I remembered all those nights from years ago when he'd sneak into my room after a nightmare, how I'd hold him close and tell him I'd never let anything hurt him. I remembered his little voice saying, "Mom, you're my best friend." And now, here he was, grown, successful, settled, and asking me to go. When he finished talking, he placed his hand on mine. "You'll be happier there, Mom," he said softly, as if trying to convince himself. I looked at his hand, larger and stronger now, the same hand that once held mine so tightly as a child. I wanted to pull it close, to tell him that happiness for me was never about where I lived, but who I lived with. But instead, I just nodded again and said, "All right, my son, if that's what you think is right." My words trembled, and I had to look away before he could see the tears welling in my eyes. After he left for work, I sat there alone in the kitchen for a long time. The walls felt colder, the air heavier. I could still hear his words echoing in my mind. A place of your own. I wondered what own meant now. I had once built a home filled with laughter and love, where his pictures hung on every wall. That house was gone, but I had believed that home wasn't a building, it was the people you loved. Yet as I sat there in silence, I realized how fragile that belief had become. Over the next few days, I began packing the few belongings I had left. My clothes, a few photographs I'd rescued from the fire, a small jewelry box, and my late husband's watch. These were all I had. Each item felt like a piece of the life that was slipping further away. My grandson asked why I was packing, and I smiled at him, telling him I was moving to a place where grandmas have friends and gardens. He smiled back, innocent and unaware of what those words truly meant. That smile was both a comfort and a heartbreak. It reminded me of what love once felt like before life complicated it. On my last night there, I stood by the window of the guest room, watching the lights flicker across the neighborhood. I thought about how time had quietly changed everything, how the boy who once depended on me now wanted independence from me. I couldn't hate him for it. Love doesn't turn to hate that easily, but I did grieve for the closeness we once had, for the unspoken distance that had grown between us, for the way I was being let go not out of anger, but out of quiet practicality. As I lay down to sleep, I whispered a prayer, not for myself, but for him. I asked for his happiness, his peace, his success, and though my heart ached, I also thanked God for at least giving me a son who had the life I always wanted for him, even if it no longer included me. Sometimes, love means stepping away without complaint. Sometimes, it means letting go without expecting to be held back. That night, I learned the hardest truth of all, that even when love remains, its place in someone's life can fade. And when it does, you don't fight it, you simply carry it quietly within you, like a candle flickering against the wind. The day my son drove me to the retirement community, the sky was gray, heavy with clouds that threatened rain. It felt fitting somehow, as if the weather understood the heaviness sitting inside my chest. The car ride was quiet, just the hum of the engine and the occasional sound of my son clearing his throat. I sat in the passenger seat, looking out the window, watching the familiar streets blur into ones I didn't recognize. My hands were folded in my lap, and though I tried to keep them still, they trembled slightly. I told myself it was just age, but I knew it was heartbreak. There are moments in life when silence says more than words ever could, and that drive was one of them. I stole glances at my son, his eyes fixed on the road, his expression calm but distant. He had always been a serious child, thoughtful, reserved. I used to tell him that he had an old soul, wise beyond his years. Now as I looked at the man beside me, I saw traces of that same boy, but also something else. A wall, a quiet, polite distance that told me this was no longer my world to belong in. I wanted to say something, anything, but every time I opened my mouth, the words dissolved before they could form. What could I say? That I was afraid? That I didn't want to go, that the thought of sleeping in a strange bed surrounded by strangers made my chest ache. No, I didn't want to burden him further. When we finally pulled into the driveway of the retirement home, I stared at the building for a long moment. It was large, clean, and well kept, with rows of windows that reflected the pale morning light. A small garden sat near the entrance, full of bright flowers and neatly trimmed bushes. To anyone else, it might have looked peaceful, even welcoming. But to me, it looked like a place where people went to wait for time to pass, for visits that rarely came, for the world to forget them slowly. My son parked the car and turned to me with a small smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. "It's nice here, Mom," he said softly. "You'll like it." I nodded, forcing a smile in return. "I'm sure I will," I whispered, though my voice barely came out. My throat felt tight, like the air itself was refusing to move. He got out of the car first and came around to help me out. His hand was gentle but quick, as if he didn't want to linger in this moment. I took his arm and walked beside him toward the entrance. Each step felt heavier than the last. I could feel the stares of a few residents, sitting outside on benches, their eyes curious and kind, but distant, like people who had seen this scene many times before. A new arrival, another soul carrying memories that no longer had a home. Inside, the receptionist greeted us with a cheerful smile, speaking in a tone too bright for the situation. "Welcome. You must be Mrs. Khan. We've been expecting you." Expecting me, as if this had been planned, as if this was where I belonged. My son handled the paperwork, his voice steady, professional. I stood beside him, clutching my purse tightly, feeling smaller than I ever had before. It was strange how the roles had reversed, how the boy I once held by the hand was now the one signing papers for me, deciding where I would live, what my next chapter would look like. Life has a cruel way of circling back on itself, but never quite in the way we hope. After the formalities, a young woman led us down a hallway to my new room. The walls were painted a pale beige, and the floor gleamed under the fluorescent lights. It didn't smell like home. It smelled sterile, clean, too clean. She opened the door to a small but tidy room, a single bed, a dresser, a window overlooking the garden, and a small table with a vase of fake flowers. "This is your space," she said warmly. "You can decorate it however you like." I nodded again, though I knew there wasn't much left to decorate it with. The few things I owned were packed neatly in a small suitcase by my feet. My clothes, a few photographs, and a folded blanket that somehow still carried the faint scent of my old home before it burned. My son placed the suitcase on the bed and looked around. "It's not bad," he said. "Peaceful, right?" I smiled faintly, not trusting myself to speak. He sat on the edge of the bed for a moment, his hands clasped together, glancing at me occasionally. I could tell he was trying to convince himself that he had done the right thing, that this was for my comfort, my safety. I didn't blame him for that. I understood. Life had made him practical, just as it had made me sentimental. Where he saw solutions, I saw memory. Where he saw a fresh start, I saw an ending. When he finally stood up to leave, my heart sank even though I knew it was coming. He hugged me briefly, gently, and said, "I'll come visit soon, Mom." I nodded, resting my hand on his arm for a moment longer than I should have. I wanted to hold on, to keep him there just a little longer, but I let go. I watched him walk out the door, down the hallway, until I couldn't see him anymore. The sound of his footsteps faded, replaced by the quiet hum of the building, a distant conversation, a radio playing softly, somewhere, the creak of a wheelchair, and then silence. I sat on the bed, staring at the window. Outside, the clouds had finally broken, and a light drizzle began to fall. Raindrops slid down the glass in slow, uneven lines. I pressed my hand against the cool surface and whispered softly, "Maybe this is where I start again." The words felt strange, foreign, but they were the only ones I could find. I thought about everything I had lost. My home, my husband, the warmth of family dinners, the laughter of my grandson, and realized that maybe life had brought me here, not to punish me, but to test me one last time, to see if I could still find strength in solitude. As the rain continued, I unpacked my suitcase. I placed my husband's watch on the dresser, my photos on the table, and the old blanket across the bed. With each item, I tried to weave a little piece of my old life into this unfamiliar space. It wasn't much, but it was some. I knew the days ahead would be quiet, that I'd have to adjust to the rhythm of this new world, meals at fixed hours, scheduled activities, strangers becoming neighbors. It wouldn't be easy, but perhaps in the stillness, I would rediscover a part of myself that had been buried beneath years of being a mother, a wife, a caregiver. That night, as I lay in bed listening to the rain, I thought about my son. I wondered if he felt any heaviness as he drove home, or if relief had already taken its place. I hoped he wouldn't carry guilt. I didn't want that for him. He had his own family, his own responsibilities, his own life to live, and though my heart ached, I knew love sometimes means letting go quietly, without bitterness, without blame. The pain of separation doesn't always come from anger, sometimes it comes from understanding too well. I knew he loved me, but love isn't always enough to bridge the gap that time and change create. As sleep began to pull me under, I whispered one last prayer, not for myself, but for him, that he would never feel this kind of loneliness, that his home would always remain full of warmth and belonging. And with that thought, I closed my eyes, knowing that though my heart was broken, it still beat, and that was enough to keep me going, one quiet day at a time.